Hannah Whitmore finished another exhausting workday at the cosmetic research and manufacturing facility on the outskirts of Raleigh. By the time she shut down her computer and slipped on her coat, the fluorescent lights above the production floor seemed harsher than usual, buzzing faintly as if echoing the pressure that had followed her all day. Her position demanded constant vigilance. Every batch required inspection. Every supplier call carried potential delays or compliance issues. Every final decision rested on her signature. If something went wrong, it was her name attached to the outcome. She walked out into the late afternoon air with a familiar heaviness in her chest. The work itself no longer frightened her. She had grown used to responsibility. What weighed on her was the knowledge that it never ended when the workday did. On the drive home, her thoughts moved in the same tired circle. The mortgage payment due at the end of the month. Utility bills that always seemed higher than expected. Groceries. School expenses for Emma. And Brian. Always Brian. Her disabled husband, waiting at home, dependent on her for nearly everything. The road blurred slightly as she stopped at a red light, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel while she mentally calculated numbers she had already calculated 100 times before. When Hannah pulled into the apartment complex and climbed the stairs to their unit, the silence inside greeted her before anything else. Brian was where he usually was, stretched out on the couch in the living room, the television flickering across his face. He barely turned his head when she came in. His body remained still, heavy, as if movement itself required more effort than he was willing to give. Once he had been restless, energetic, always in motion. Now inactivity had become his natural state. Hannah set down her bag and stood there for a moment, watching him. There was no anger in her, only a dull, familiar fatigue. Brian seemed distant, withdrawn, locked inside himself. Conversations had grown shorter, silences longer. Most days he drifted between the couch and sleep, detached from the rhythm of the household that continued to depend entirely on her. As Hannah moved through the evening routine, she felt the quiet weight of resignation settle over her. This was her life now, responsibility without pause, sacrifice without acknowledgement, and the unspoken understanding that tomorrow would look exactly the same. There was a time when Brian Whitmore had been a very different man. Hannah remembered it clearly, even though it felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Back then, Brian had been independent and self-assured, proud of the work he did. He drove long-haul routes across several states, spending days on the road, navigating highways that stretched endlessly ahead of him. He liked the solitude, the changing scenery, the sense that he was providing for his family through his own effort. He had never been afraid of hard work, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed he was useful. The change did not happen all at once. At first, it was only complaints of back pain after long drives, stiffness that lingered even on his days off. Hannah urged him to see a doctor, and he brushed it aside, insisting it was nothing serious. But the pain grew worse. Sitting for long periods became difficult. Sleep brought little relief. Then came the heart issues, episodes of shortness of breath, dizzy spells that sent him to the emergency room more than once. Hospital visits became more frequent, medical terms more alarming. Doctors began to speak carefully, advising Brian to consider a different line of work. They warned him that the strain of long-haul driving was worsening his condition. Brian resisted the idea fiercely. Driving was not just a job to him, it was his identity. For a while, he tried to push through the pain, convinced that determination alone would be enough. Eventually, though, the effort became impossible to sustain. He stopped working altogether. It was then that Evelyn Whitmore stepped in. Brian's mother had spent years building professional connections through her own career, and she used them decisively. Medical assessments were arranged. Paperwork was processed. Before long, Brian was officially classified as disabled. The decision was presented as final, unquestionable. Hannah accepted it without hesitation. She trusted the doctors. She trusted Evelyn. Most of all, she trusted Brian. She believed he truly could not work, that his condition left him with no choice. From that moment on, she took responsibility without resentment, certain that she was doing what any devoted wife would do. Trust settled in quietly, and with it began Brian's complete dependence on her. As the months passed, Evelyn Whitmore's presence in Hannah's life grew heavier. What she called concern was delivered as constant criticism. She questioned Hannah's choices, her routines, her attitude, always with the same underlying message, that Hannah was not doing enough as a wife. If Brian seemed withdrawn, it was because he lacked emotional support. If he appeared unmotivated, it was because Hannah did not encourage him properly. Every conversation left Hannah feeling subtly at fault. The pressure was never loud, never openly cruel. It came wrapped in moral obligation. Evelyn spoke of sacrifice as duty, of patience as love, of endurance as proof of character. She reminded Hannah how fragile Brian was, how difficult life had become for him. Any sign of fatigue from Hannah was met with quiet disapproval. A good wife, Evelyn implied, did not complain. Hannah absorbed it all in silence. She paid the mortgage on time, month after month. She covered utilities, groceries, insurance, medical copays, prescriptions. Every expense passed through her hands. Her salary became the foundation on which the household stood. Yet no one spoke of it as contribution. It was simply expected. Brian, meanwhile, showed little interest in changing his situation. Rehabilitation appointments were postponed or skipped. Suggestions about remote work or part-time options were dismissed almost immediately. He claimed pain, exhaustion, lack of focus. The idea of adapting to his limitations never seemed to take root. Instead, his days followed a predictable pattern. Hours on the couch, television playing in the background. Complaints about how unfair life had been to him. Hannah's own world began to shrink. She woke early, went to work, came home, managed the household, and repeated the cycle. Ambitions she once held quietly faded. There was no space for long-term plans, no energy left for personal growth. Survival became the goal. Getting through the day without something collapsing under the weight of responsibility felt like an achievement. Over time, Hannah stopped questioning whether things could be different. The routine hardened into reality. Responsibility was no longer something she carried temporarily. It defined her entire existence. And beneath it all, the belief remained that this was simply what love required of her. The first time Thomas Grant called Hannah into his office to commend her work, she had been genuinely surprised. He spoke plainly, without flattery, pointing to performance reports and quality metrics that consistently placed her at the top of her department. As recognition, he offered her something the company reserved for only a few employees each year, an annual wellness retreat designed for rest, recovery, and professional renewal. Hannah glanced at the paperwork and felt a brief, unfamiliar sense of longing. Time away from responsibility sounded almost unreal. The thought of stepping out of her routine, even for a short while, felt dangerous. Before she could reconsider, she asked if the benefit could be transferred. When Thomas looked up in surprise, she explained that her husband was disabled and struggling with his health. Rehabilitation, she said, would help him far more than it would help her. Thomas hesitated, then agreed. That decision quietly set a pattern. In the years that followed, whenever an opportunity came Hannah's way, whether it was a retreat, specialized therapy access, or wellness-related support, she redirected it to Brian. Each time, she told herself the same thing. This one might help. This one might be different. Perhaps structured treatment, professional supervision, or a change of environment would give Brian the motivation he lacked. Brian went willingly enough. He traveled to rehabilitation centers, attended sessions, followed the prescribed routines while he was there. Hannah waited at home, hopeful counting days until his return. She imagined him coming back lighter, more engaged, ready to reclaim some sense of purpose. But each time the outcome was the same. Brian returned unchanged. Within days, the routines dissolved. Complaints replaced effort. Frustration settled into bitterness, and dependence resumed its familiar shape. He spoke dismissively about the programs, insisting they were useless, that no one truly understood his condition. Hannah never argued. She listened, reassured, adjusted her expectations downward once more. Opportunity after opportunity slipped through her hands, quietly surrendered in the belief that sacrifice was temporary. She did not notice when hope stopped accompanying those decisions, replaced instead by habit and obligation. When Thomas Grant asked Hannah to come into his office again, she expected another routine discussion about production schedules or supplier audits. Instead, he closed the door and spoke with an unusual seriousness. There was an opening. He explained a long-term assignment the company rarely offered, a placement in Paris, working directly with one of their partner laboratories on advanced formulation development. It was the kind of opportunity that reshaped careers. He laid out the details carefully. The company would provide housing. The compensation reflected the scope of responsibility. There would be logistical support for the move, and arrangements could be made for Emma to attend an international school connected to the American expatriate community. It was not a temporary business trip, but a chance to build something new. Hannah listened in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She understood immediately what this meant. Paris was not just a city, it was access to a different professional world, broader networks, long-term growth. People waited years for chances like this. Some never received them at all. For a brief moment, excitement stirred inside her. She imagined a different rhythm of life. Work that challenged her in ways she had once dreamed of. Emma thriving in a new environment. The vision was vivid, and then it faded. Brian's face surfaced in her mind, as it always did. He could not manage alone. He struggled with the simplest routines. Grocery shopping, appointments, household tasks. All of it depended on her. Leaving him behind felt unthinkable. Responsibility pressed down on the excitement until it was barely recognizable. Thomas watched her expression change. He did not rush her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, practiced. She thanked him for the offer and declined. She explained that her family situation made it impossible. She told herself the words sounded reasonable. As she left the office, there was no sense of relief. Only a quiet ache settled in her chest. She stood for a moment by the window in the hallway, looking out at the gray skyline of Raleigh, aware that somewhere beyond it lay a life she would not step into. She repeated the same reassurance she always did, that she had done the right thing. That responsibility came first. Yet the feeling that followed her back to her desk was not peace. It was grief, subdued and wordless, for something she had given up before it ever truly began. Hannah returned home earlier than usual that afternoon, the workday ending abruptly after a canceled meeting. The apartment felt no different than it ever did, quiet, still, carrying the faint hum of the television from the living room. She slipped off her shoes and set her bag down, already shifting into the familiar rhythm of home. Brian looked up briefly when he heard her enter. He mentioned, almost casually, that a courier had arrived earlier with a delivery for Emma. A pair of headphones, he said. The package was still downstairs at the front desk. Before Hannah could respond, Brian surprised her by reaching for his jacket. He said he would go get it himself. The words sounded ordinary, but the action caught her off guard. He rarely volunteered for anything that required leaving the apartment. She nodded without comment and watched him head toward the door. The sound of it closing behind him left the apartment unusually quiet. Hannah moved into the kitchen. The sink was full, dishes left from lunch. Crumbs scattered across the counter. She turned on the faucet and began to clean, her movements automatic, practiced from years of repetition. Her thoughts drifted unfocused, as they often did during moments like this. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt wrong. As she rinsed a plate, the water pressure suddenly surged. A spray of cold droplets splashed across the counter, catching the edge of Brian's new phone where it lay beside the sink. The screen lit up instantly in response. Hannah instinctively reached for a towel, intending to dry it before any damage could be done. The phone vibrated in her hand. A notification appeared across the screen, a voice message. The sender's name was Evelyn. Hannah paused. She had no intention of listening. The phone was not hers. The message was clearly meant for Brian. Still, the screen remained lit, the notification hovering in the quiet kitchen. The moment felt completely ordinary, the kind of small, forgettable interruption that happened every day. The apartment was calm. The afternoon light filtered through the window. Nothing suggested that anything was about to change. And yet, standing there with the phone in her hand, Hannah felt a faint, unexplainable tension settle in her chest, as if the stillness itself were holding its breath. Hannah did not mean to listen. She stood in the kitchen with the phone still in her hand, intending only to lock the screen and set it aside. But before she could move, the voice message began to play, triggered by the slightest shift of her fingers. Evelyn's voice filled the quiet room. She was speaking quickly, her tone sharp with irritation. She mentioned a name Hannah had never heard before, Olivia. The words that followed were disjointed at first, references to timing, to plans that Evelyn clearly did not approve of. Something about moving too fast, something about not being careful enough. Hannah felt a sudden chill spread through her chest. Her hand trembled as she stopped the message. For a few seconds, she simply stood there, staring at the screen. The name echoed in her mind. Olivia. Her heart began to beat harder, faster, each pulse pressing against her ribs. Against her better judgment, Hannah opened the message history. The first voice recording was from Brian. His voice sounded relaxed, almost cheerful. He spoke about Olivia Brooks as if discussing something natural, inevitable. He said she was wonderful, that he had fallen in love with her. He talked about how lonely he had been, how he deserved happiness too. Then his words shifted, becoming practical, calculating. He explained his plan to have Olivia move into the apartment while Hannah was abroad. He spoke as if Hannah's absence was already decided, as if it were merely a logistical detail. Hannah sank onto a kitchen stool, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Another message played. Brian talked about money. He joked lightly about Hannah's salary in Paris, about how she would send money home without question. He said it would be good for her career, that she would even be grateful to him someday for pushing her to focus on herself. He laughed softly, as though the idea amused him. The next message was from Evelyn. Her tone was no longer irritated, but tense. She warned Brian about being reckless. She spoke about legal risks, about neighbors, about what might happen if Hannah discovered the truth. She mentioned disability reviews, investigations, questions that could be raised if matters went to court. Brian's response came quickly. He dismissed her concerns with confidence. He said Hannah would never challenge him. He outlined his options calmly, claiming his share of the apartment, applying for child support, continuing to receive benefits as a disabled man. He spoke as if the outcome were guaranteed, as if the system itself existed to protect him. Then came Evelyn's final message. Her voice dropped lower, stripped of pretense. She admitted that his disability status had been arranged, that it depended on paperwork and influence, not on an unquestionable medical truth. She warned him that if authorities looked too closely, everything could unravel. Hannah could not listen any further. The phone slipped from her hand onto the counter. Her understanding of her marriage collapsed in that instant. The years of sacrifice, the trust, the quiet endurance, all of it revealed as a carefully maintained illusion. She had not been a partner. She had been a resource, and the life she believed she was holding together had never truly existed at all. Hannah left the apartment without fully realizing what she was doing. She grabbed her coat, stepped into the hallway, and moved forward as if guided by instinct rather than thought. The familiar surroundings blurred together. The stairwell, the front door, the cold air outside. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Shock held her steady, hollow, and quiet, as though emotion had been temporarily shut off to keep her moving. She walked for several minutes before stopping. Only then did she reach into her bag and take out her phone. Her hands were still trembling as she scrolled through her contacts and found Thomas Grant's name. When he answered, she did not explain. There was no story, no justification, no hesitation left to work through. She took a breath and said simply that she accepted the Paris assignment. Thomas paused, surprised, but did not press her. He told her the arrangements would begin immediately. The call ended as calmly as it had begun. That moment marked the first decision Hannah had made in years that belonged entirely to her. The weeks that followed moved quickly. Paperwork replaced shock. Plans replaced paralysis. Hannah organized the transition with the same quiet efficiency she had applied to everything else in her life. She told Emma about the move, bracing herself for resistance that never came. Emma listened with wide eyes, curiosity outweighing fear, and asked questions about school, about friends, about the city they would see. France became real not through excitement, but through action. Flights were booked. Housing was secured. Boxes were packed. In Paris, Emma adapted faster than Hannah expected. She found her footing in school, made friends, laughed more easily. Watching her daughter settle into a new rhythm brought Hannah an unfamiliar sense of calm. For the first time in years, the constant tension in Hannah's chest began to ease. There were still fears ahead, questions without answers. But beneath them was something new, a quiet relief, steady and undeniable, that came from finally choosing herself. From Paris, Hannah initiated the divorce through an attorney recommended by her company's legal department. The process unfolded quietly, without dramatic gestures or public accusations. She provided documents, answered questions, and followed instructions with the same steady discipline that had guided her professional life for years. Distance did not weaken her resolve. If anything, it clarified it. Brian reacted exactly as she had expected. When he received notice of the filing, his response was immediate and defiant. He contested the divorce, insisting on his share of the apartment in Raleigh. He cited his disability, emphasizing his inability to support himself and framing the property as his only security. His tone, conveyed through legal filings and messages relayed by counsel, was confident, almost rehearsed. Hannah's attorney reviewed the case carefully. Rather than engaging in emotional arguments, he focused on records, financial statements, payment histories, medical documentation. He raised the issue of Brian's disability status, not as an accusation, but as a point that could not be ignored if the case proceeded to court. The possibility of scrutiny, of formal review by authorities, shifted the balance immediately. Evelyn understood the implications before Brian did. She recognized how fragile the situation truly was, how dependent it had always been on appearances and influence rather than unquestionable fact. She pressured Brian to reconsider, to settle quietly before matters escalated beyond control. For the first time, her authority over him sounded strained. Court proceedings moved forward without spectacle. Evidence showed that Hannah had been solely responsible for the mortgage payments year after year, utilities, maintenance costs, insurance, every financial obligation tied to the apartment traced back to her income. The narrative of shared contribution collapsed under documentation. The court ordered the apartment to be sold. Brian waited for his portion, clinging to the belief that something would remain. But when the numbers were finalized, reality replaced expectation. Outstanding debt absorbed, nearly everything attributed to him. His claimed share vanished into obligations he had never helped fulfill. When the process concluded, Brian was left with nothing of substance. No apartment, no financial cushion, no leverage. The systems he had relied on to protect him no longer served their purpose. Hannah received confirmation of the outcome while sitting in her Paris apartment. The message brief and factual. She read it once, then set the phone aside. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet certainty that what had happened was not revenge, but consequence. When everything was finalized, Brian returned to his mother's home with a single suitcase, expecting at least the familiarity of protection. He rang the doorbell and waited, rehearsing explanations he no longer fully believed. Evelyn opened the door, looked him over briefly, and stepped aside without warmth. There was no relief in her expression, no reassurance, only distance. Inside, the atmosphere was colder than he had imagined. Evelyn made it clear, without raising her voice, that his presence was an inconvenience. She spoke of responsibility, of consequences, of exhaustion. The son she had once shielded now represented a risk she no longer wished to carry. Brian understood quickly that the support he expected would not return. He had become a burden, with no savings and nowhere else to go. Brian took the first work he could find. The job was physically demanding, far removed from the life he had grown used to. Long hours, heavy labor, no allowances for pain or fatigue. His health began to deteriorate in ways that could no longer be ignored. The back pain intensified. His strength faded. There was no couch to retreat to, no one to soften the consequences of his choices. Across the ocean, Hannah's life moved in a different direction. In Paris, she built a routine that belonged to her alone. Her work challenged her without consuming her. Evenings were quieter, lighter. Emma thrived, growing more confident each day, her laughter returning to the center of their home. For Hannah, the absence of constant strain felt unfamiliar at first, then liberating. Thomas Grant remained present, steady but never demanding. He offered support without expectation, companionship without pressure. Over time, Hannah learned to accept that kindness did not have to be earned through sacrifice. Standing at the window of her apartment one evening, Hannah realized that for the first time, her life was not shaped by obligation. She was no longer defined by what she gave up for others. She was finally facing life directly on her own terms, with clarity instead of endurance.